Covenants have always been a beloved mainstay in the Souls franchise. This is the evolution of Covenants in the series, starting with Demon Souls. While you may be wondering, yo, Evan, Covenants aren't in Demon Souls, what's the big idea? And while you technically may be right, I wanted to talk about its mechanics that I think were conceptually pretty similar to later titles, and that I think laid down some good groundwork of the traditional Covenants mechanic. This makes its appearance in the form of World Tendency, one of the most ambivalent mechanics in the game. This is essentially a karma system that changes certain aspects of the game based off of your actions throughout your playthrough. At the beginning, it starts off as a neutral level, but can sway between white and black states, with white reflecting a good and black reflecting an evil. However, these states aren't exclusive, and there does exist middle grounds between them. Actions that forward your world tendency to white include things like killing an area boss in a level, killing an invader or other specific enemies, while actions that skew it to black include dying in human form or selfishly murdering an NPC. Certain events and changes in world states will occur based on your tendency as well. Let's take the Boletarian Palace as an example for these changes. The more you lean towards pure white, the more enemies will generally be easier and drop more health related items at the expense of dropping less souls. The true dragons you see roaming around 1-1 will completely disappear, and then the game will summon the Executioner Meralda NPC you couldn't fight before. On the contrary, the more you lean back towards black, the more difficult and abundant the enemies become, but they really grant better rewards for killing them. An enemy named Primeval Demon will appear, which doesn't really do much except indicate that your world state is swaying towards the dark side. And they also just never appear again in that specific level if you kill them. And then a Black Phantom variation of Meralda appears instead. If an NPC that is typically friendly appears in this form, they are always going to be hostile, but the Executioner is indifferent. What changes with the Black Phantoms? Well, apart from them being referred to as enemies of man and God, they both have different drops and shift your tendencies in different ways. Oh yeah, did I forget to mention character tendency? It acts completely independent of what you do in each of the Archstones and focuses more on your own character's morality for the whole playthrough. It affects things like your damage as a co-op phantom, damage in soul form, or damage as an invader, as well as changing certain NPC types. This is honestly a really extensive and fleshed out mechanic for its time, and I absolutely think that overall it was a really good addition for a game like this, as it just accentuates a lot of the RPG elements that make up a Souls game. And it's not like it appears as a one-off thing, it's something that directly affects your experience throughout the entire game. Many players may find this mechanic tedious, as certain actions may lock you out of certain gameplay paths, or may make the game more difficult and sometimes will give players a sense of needing to min-max, but I digress. Much of its later influence can be seen with the developers placing such importance on a mechanic like this in further iterations, but it was truly special for Demon Souls. But now it's time to move on to the beloved Dark Souls. This is the formal introduction of Covenants. In this game, they act as your world factions. There is much less emphasis on karma and morality in this game, and it takes a focus on way more online multiplayer systems than the overall game. Not to suggest that the certain events based off of players' actions as certain Covenant members don't happen or affect the game, but it was more streamlined as a co-op or PvP mechanic. One of the most famous examples of this is in the Warrior of Sunlight Covenant, home of the fan favorite, Solaire.
If only I could be so grossly incandescent.
Solaire first introduced the idea of jolly cooperation to you, and bestowed to you the White Soapstone. Many of the Covenants in Dark Souls work like this. You met a specific requirement, whether a general one in the world or with an NPC. You went to the specific altar or mentor and swore your allegiance to them, and now you were a part of their covenant. Once you pledged, you could progress through the Covenant ranks as a member. Using Warriors of Sunlight as an example, it's a cooperative focused allegiance, and by participating in boss fights with hosts, you were granted a reward, Sunlight medals that you could offer to the Covenant in order to further your rank, and in turn you would receive rewards, such as the Great Lightning Spear. On the contrary, with a PvP Covenant like the Dark Wraiths, you were granted a Dark Hand, which made it so that if you landed its special move on your players and NPCs, it would take the humanities from them and improve your rank in the Covenant, which would eventually grant you the Red Eye Orb to indefinitely invade other players. The Dark Wraith armor set and ability to suckle down more humanities made this one a staple. The main drawbacks of these old games is that there may not really be an active player base that you can sufficiently interact with the Covenants and grind all the items for. And in turn, it kind of takes away a huge part of the Dark Souls gameplay loop and makes it much more tedious if you were to hop on now. It also makes playing offline feel more empty. And when Dark Souls passed the torch to later entries, there were less reasons to ever try role-playing into the Covenants. Which is a shame considering you can tap into some of these in really cool ways. Like entering a coffin that takes you to a boss room of the Covenant leader. Or meeting a literal everlasting dragon in a multi-universal forest stuck in time. Without the drawback though, it's nice to see how Dark Souls really refined the foundation that Demon Souls laid out in a very established way, with a fresh set of ideas, and it changed how this feature would typically function for the games to come. Is that the War Thunder Covenant available on PC and mobile? If we're to praise the sun, we need to praise the historically accurate over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 major nations, ranging from biplanes and armored cars of the 1920s to the fighter jets and main battle tanks of today with War Thunder. Have you seen Blighttown? We will need the most powerful war machines of our time. With an unmatched wealth of high-quality content to discover, there's simply no game better suited for fans of military history. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and is now available for free on PC and consoles. For you, and you only, I have a link in the description of this video and the pinned comment that viewers of this video can follow for a limited time and register with a new account or sign into an old one that is not played in the last 6 months. You'll receive a bonus pack across all platforms after the next login to the game. This includes 3 premium vehicles depending on which country you're in. You'll get vehicles related to your country. For me, it was the exclusive decorator Eagle of Valor, 100,000 silver, and 7 days of premium account access. Thanks to War Thunder for letting me talk about this, and now, back to Covenants. Dark Souls 2 is kind of just the neighbor's weird kid of all Souls games, but ultimately for Covenants, it served the feature well while still fundamentally remaining the same as the first game. Still having a pretty clear-cut focus on the multiplayer of the game. But there are a few innovative ideas, and it deserved a lot more praise for how alive and purposeful they felt in this game that can make this iteration of the feature stand out among others in the series. Firstly, each of them still ranked from level 0 to level 3, and each Covenant also had their own special ring that played around with different mechanics or stats for players trying out different builds. It was also the first game to include an indicator on the HUD to where your allegiance was, and offered a nice touch to the game's look. The co-op/PvP oriented Covenants make a complete return, but there is one pretty crazy exception in this game, known as the Company of Champions, that you can access right from when you get to Majula. All you had to do was go up this grave, swear your allegiance, and congratulations, you activated the first example of a true hard mode in any SoulsBorne game. It increased every single enemy's damage by 50% and decreased players' damage by 20%. It also just removed all forms of co-op play while still allowing invasions. This game was also the first to really introduce a proper territory warfare in the form of the Bellkeepers or the Rat King Covenants. Sure, the Forest Hunters did count in a way, but Dark Souls 2 stepped it up here. After murdering many of his kin and the Royal Rat Vanguard, you met the Rat King, who for some reason has gained his respect for you and offers you to join as an honorary Rat Bro in order to defend his territories. With the crest of the Rat Ring, you proudly showed your allegiance, and whenever a non-Covenant member entered any of the Rat King's territories, you had a chance of being summoned into your world for battle. This game was also the first to introduce the Way of Blue and Blue Sentinels dynamic. If you joined the Way of Blue Covenant, members of the Blue Sentinels would be sent to your world if an invader was present to help you fight them. Despite Dark Souls 2 reception as probably the weakest Souls game, you have to really hand it to them in the Covenants and multiplayer department, as they came out with so many fun hits and innovative ideas that just built on top of the last 2 games that had already laid out the foundation. And while I can't explicitly state the general consensus of how players typically felt about it, I still think it's something genuinely worth appreciating. Bloodborne took an entirely different route, and not only does it offer fundamental gameplay changes, it also offers a change in covenants in the form of oaths. You would think that the world of Yharnam's twisted heresy and political landscape, its focus on the different sectors of hunters, blood, and beasts, that there would be a ton to dissect here in regards to covenants. Well, yes and no. Some are discovered through long NPC quests and have some secret interactions, while others are the standard of walking up to an NPC and just having a discussion, then pledging allegiance. But after looking back at the ways that you would be initiated into a covenant, it made me question if this feature even existed to my memory when I popped Bloodborne back into my PlayStation. The covenants aren't super ambitious with fully fleshed out allegiance systems, but they exist more as a playstyle and build choice if anything. For an example of quest relation, look no further than Eileen the Crow. The way to access the Hunter of Hunter's Oath was to complete a long quest without letting her die, and that is easier said than done. Letting her die by the hands of her mark just straight up kills any hope for gaining access to the Covenant. But if by the end of the quest you are successful, you're rewarded with the Oath Rune, which made it possible to buy her Crow Feather armor set and Blades of Mercy. But there wasn't anything past this, just the Hunter Rune, which increased stamina regen by 10%, a generally pretty good choice for a simple solo player. The way these Oath Runes worked is kind of why I forgot Bloodborne had Covenant features in the first place, and they were weird to track across the game. But there are some Covenants that had at least a taste of what Dark Souls offered. What I found interesting in making this video was that the League Covenant was added in a later patch in November of 2015, just ahead of the DLC. You need vermin to be offered by killing bosses for players in a co-op setting, and at only 5 vermin, the reward was a snake summoning whistle. Yeah, I'm not joking, this thing ripped. Then there was the Vile Bloods Covenant, which is still hard to compare to a Souls Covenant, but it's the only other oath that comes close. At the end of the Castle Cainhurst quest, a secret area nonetheless, you will meet a queen that requires you to wear a crown to get into her room, who will let you join her covenant and give you the gesture of respect. But if you kill an NPC or another player hunter while wearing the Vile Blood's corrupted oath rune, you just get a deeper respect gesture as a reward. And that's really it. It's not really a fleshed out multiplayer covenant, but I guess it does grant rewards to 2 extremely simple rank ups. So at a very bare bones level, it passes. Funny enough, the Executioner's Covenant is discovered by bringing the NPC Alfred out here to the Vile Blood's Covenant to hunt down and slaughter the Vile Blood Queen. As mentioned, Bloodborne doesn't really focus much on allegiances as opposed to character builds, but I guess becoming a literal beast or alien is about as pledged to a cause as one can be. Now, with so much variety in their playstyles and the nature of Bloodborne's oath system compared to previous titles, does this mean that Bloodborne was a proper, innovative evolution in the From Software catalog? Well, I think Bloodborne's oaths were a little too directionless and inconsistent compared to the last games, but maybe that's because it was a PlayStation exclusive and From Software didn't know what to add on consoles for an online space. But I'll let you decide. In Dark Souls 3, there was a rightful passage of time since the last 2 Souls entries, so with the anticipated release, From Software launched the game with 8 base game covenants, and then added a 9th in the DLC. There is a worm covenant called the Mound Makers, which blends the secrecy of its discovery with the grinding that Dark Souls was all too familiar with. This one had a crazy story to even join. If you were in the undead settlement and chose to talk to this caged NPC, he gave a small hint that seemingly made no sense, telling you that the Nana has disappeared, but the grandson carries a cage. If you made any sense of this, because it made sense to someone on a Reddit thread somewhere, then you would run up to this specific NPC and jump into his cage for an actual cutscene. Then you would talk to a guy named Holy Knight Hodrick, and boom, you're in, for some grinding of invading worlds to stack up the Covenant progress. Proper territorial covenants made somewhat of a return with the Aldrich Faithfuls and the Farron Watchdogs, although many members of the community have some disdain for these Covenant members, mainly in the random crucifixion wood invasions, which would make you go mad trying to progress the game. But at the exact same time, they were just probably some of the more enjoyable PvP moments early game. The Aldrich Faithfuls had you take down an illusory wall to get to Pontiff's beasts, which were very tough to kill. But once you slayed them and prayed to his archdeacons to join the covenants, And as the name suggested, you would be peacekeeping Anor Londo in order to protect Aldrich's remains. The Farron watchdogs are the same, but for trespassers in the Farron woods. The dynamic of the Way of Blue and the Blue Sentinel's introduction in Dark Souls 2 are fully back, except this time the Way of Blue Knights now includes the Blades of the Dark Moon. As far as the rewards for the Covenant went, the most sought out after was the Dark Moon Blade Miracle, which acted completely similar to a lightning blade, just with magic damage instead, and it was a huge item for people who were speccing into faith builds. It required 30 proofs of Concord Keps from defending the Way of Blue members from sinners, banishing those sinners, or killing these Anor Londo Silver Knights. And look, I seriously want to apologize in advance for all of the people who spent tens of hours absolutely hardcore grinding these knights with their horrifically low 1% drop chance. Because in this day and age, that grind is the only way you can feasibly get it with Dark Souls 3's dwindling player base. And now it's time to talk about the Spears of the Church. If you played through Dark Souls 3 offline, you would probably see the Half-Light boss as a normal player NPC with a fixed build and moveset and think and whatever. But if you played online, there was a good chance you would come into contact with an actual player as the boss instead, with a guardian helping his fight as well. Defeating Dark Eater Midir would grant you the ability to join this covenant, and let you become the boss fight yourself in order to protect Filianor's slumber. Dark Souls 3 Covenants were a good addition that did add up overall to the experience of the game, but were honestly just kind of put on the back pedal with some simple ideas as opposed to an innovative game in the Covenants department like Dark Souls 2. I don't think they were particularly good or bad, but they just weren't really a huge one-up on previous titles. Again, they were not a bad addition, and complex systems aren't always better, and they're not always worse, but they could have been more with some creativity that is Dark Souls 3. And finally, we're on to Elden Ring. Wait, where are the Covenants? Unfortunately, Dark Souls 3 was the last game to include traditional Souls Covenants, and it was just completely removed in Elden Ring. Well, in my opinion, not completely removed. See, Hidetaka Miyazaki said in an interview that From Software wanted to minimize the barriers to entry to the game's multiplayer as much as possible, which is understandable as sometimes hidden features aren't communicated super well to the player, something that the community either loves or hates. So sometimes you would never really know what warranted certain covenants to be mad at you. That being said, however, I think this had potential to have an amazing game to include traditional covenants. When I say they're not completely gone, I'm speaking in terms of the ways of factions like Volcano Manor are presented. The manor quite literally follows the formula of meeting requirements or an NPC. An NPC's request your allegiance and you accept. Then you are tasked with hunting down fellow Tarnished across the world of the Lands Between, who oppose the new faction in a series of quests, granting rewards at each successful assassination. And eventually, you'll be granted an audience with the faction leader, which doesn't typically go a route that would be done in other games. As for endings go, you meet NPCs and you're requested to follow their leadership. But committing to one of these will lock you into an ending rather than just being a pure set piece that grants rewards based off of a smaller and gradual task that you complete. The most notorious example would be Ronnie's Troop of Warriors or the Three Fingers, which have you serving their characters as a part of their faction and gives you a stark difference in the places following them takes you. It's interesting to think about the possibilities of what these groups could grant you, or what would change if they were presented in a traditional Souls game sense. I think this game had so many options for how this could have been implemented with a very intriguing variety of groups sprawling across the Lands Between, but I think From Software knew what they were going for with their bar lowering. But that was the evolution of covenants in every single Souls game. Another huge shout out to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Remember to check out the pinned comment for more information about the special promotion put on just for you. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of the rich history of these games, and if you want to see traditional covenants make a return to future From Software titles. My name is Evan, and hopefully I explained that well. I'll see you next time.